also seeking to find their role and being in charge of the whole process. Provincial governments also sought they point and establish themselves as what they termed as obligatory passage points. And then the local NGO that came with different kind of agenda, some strong advocacy and for rights and also being critical to the REDD concept, but others more actively involving community engagement. Now the communities themselves, they were seeking to refine this. They came there and to redefine REDD as community development, poverty reduction, welfare, dignity, and local rights, and had a strong agenda on that. In terms of participation, it was not easy, and it's part due to the uncertainty, and I like to quote my Norwegian colleague, Professor of Anthropology, Signe Howell, who has in an article, she says this: the principle of REDD is that you will be paid to cut down, not to cut down trees. We do not know how much you will be paid, when you will be paid, or whether you will be, in fact, will be paid, and if so, if the money will be paid directly, or if the local community will be rewarded from in other forms, such as the provision of a school, a clinic, a new road, or whatever. Do you agree to accept this scheme? It's like someone asking you, would you like to sell your car? We don't know what the price will be, if you will be paid, who will be paid, but still, would you like to sell your car? And it's not easy to kind of engage fruitfully in such a proposal. It was also noted in their study, which is based on a number of ethnographic fieldwork in central Kalimantan, that it was a bit of hostility, I have to say, towards UNDP as the fund manager for the funds. In the selection of UN organization, one of these showcases was a bamboo climate communication center, and arguing that these Dayak people should shift from using hardwood to bamboo for house building, and it was kind of a foreign idea to them, literally speaking. Some of the lessons. One of this is, when you go back to the Strada, the plan, that it illustrates a tension, that it identifies commercial drivers, but community solutions. So was it kind of targeted towards the drivers, or I think this is something I've seen in several projects. Big scale commercial operators as the key driver, the REDD focus on communities. Another one was a nice quote from a villager, that we don't want to be guinea pigs for their tests. They looked at themselves as subjects of controlled lab experiments. And that was a feeling they didn't like, and they didn't have this kind of feeling of having agency and being pioneers in a kind of a global change. And finally, the REDD in the social context, that it has to be negotiated through lengthy processes to build the linkages and foster learning, which is also inherited in this actor network approach. Ideas spread through networks and through these long-term processes of linking up. We moved to some of these subnational REDD initiatives that initially started out with the survey 2010 with 23 projects. Some dropped out, so in the second round in 2014 it was down to 17. The method that was used for all what we call Baki, before-after control intervention. It's like a randomized control. You take a pill, some get placebo, some get the real stuff, and you do a survey of how sick the patient is before and after they have taken the pill. So this is kind of the gold standard of doing this assessment. So the question, is Baki feasible? And one study led by Aaron Sills was trying to do that. Because when we did the initial matching, it was based on rapid rural appraisal, so we didn't have the deep knowledge of the villages. And then we asked at hindsight, with good and detailed household and village data, how good was the matching? And the answer is quite good, but not as good as we wanted. There were significant differences in many respects, so it was not easy to find good controls. A good control meaning that it is exactly the same conditions, except for one thing: it did take the real pill, it did have a real REDD intervention. It turned out that they were generally poor in terms of assets and infrastructure, but not in average income, maybe perhaps surprisingly, the intervention villages compared to the control. And also they had more forests, so they have targeted, it seems, more poor and more forest-rich villages for the intervention. Another problem was that a lot of the villagers in the intervention villages did not receive the treatment, whereas some in the control villages did. So it was not that easy when you were to analyze it, not just to compare at the village level, because some forgot to take the pill and others who should have gotten placebo got the pill to take the medical analogy here. I think the difference is that you need to take those different into account when you do the analysis. So it's not just straightforward. You need to do some more sophisticated analysis. So even with Baki approach, it's not straightforward. Still, they stress the value of doing it, to have the initial data there. And there's some discussion about why, if it's so useful, why isn't it happening more? Well, it's costly. It also means that some of the NGOs, they have to work, for example, in non-intervention villages. So they have to do the survey and collect data in villages where they don't plan to work, and they may be reluctant to that. And kind of the final, more subtle point is that it is a risk that you don't find great impacts, of course. And that is always the risk we take if we are being subject to thorough evaluations. It's also that impact evaluation is key to promote knowledge and learning, and it's a public good. It has a value beyond the particular project proponent. So it's a public good, and perhaps donors need to sponsor that and subsidize it kind of explicitly, because it is a public good, like carbon stored in trees. Question 4, perhaps the key question: did REDD projects reduce forest loss? And maybe as a sub-question to that is the answer depending on the method that was used. A nice paper here that I was happy to contribute a little bit to, but mainly done by Astrid Bos, who is a PhD student in Wageningen, across the border, using Hansen data and look at changes in, for simplicity, called deforestation rate, although it's not. It's tree cover change data, not deforestation data. But the change in the percentage or percentage points of forest loss, that's a variable we're going to use. Interesting with this is that it tested out two methods, just a simple before and after. If it was, say, 0.4% forest loss before, was it less or more in the period after the intervention? So a simple before-after comparison. And then you had this Baki, where you compare it to the other level, was the change in the rate. Maybe if deforestation could go up in the intervention village, but it went up less than in the control village, then you thought, well, there are some higher scale deforestation drivers that is pushing up deforestation, but the REDD project made the increase less in the intervention village. So here are the scores for those who like to refresh statistics classes. We also looked at two different levels, at the initiative level and then at the village level. So here are the results. Two ways. One, the top is kind of to group them. If there was more than 0.1 percentage point change, for example, from 0.4 to 0.3, if it was more than that, then it was termed as a good outcome. And you also see the mean score in this, so a negative is good. It means a reduction in forest cover change. So overall, what can we read out of this table? Well, the Baki shows better results than the just before after, which is nice, because if it was otherwise, we thought, yeah, we believe more in the Baki method than in just the BA. Better performance at the micro level and then at the meso level. One or two explanations can be that, okay, it's very natural to find it because at the higher level, not all villages were subject to an intervention, so it's higher local treatment intensity if you only look at the village that had the REDD project. The second, not so good explanation is that perhaps it was some leakage. So you reduce deforestation in a village, but charcoal production moved to another one. The overall performance, 9 out of 16 with Baki, had positive performance, and the average Baki results are reasonably good, I have to say. We didn't find any obvious explanation of why some are more successful than others, and need to look more into that. But yes, at local level, you can see some positive in terms of perhaps what's seen as the main role, namely to reduce emissions. What does REDD cost? And I've earlier, to continue with my car example, said it's like a silly question asking what does a car cost, because it depends on a lot of factors. We focus here, or we, I'm not one of these three, but they focus with Amy Ikovic at CIFOR, focus on the opportunity cost. And just to take on a more lecturing role for 1 minute, to teach about opportunity costs when they are, because half of the papers that I review get it wrong, literally true. And a survey made by economics PhD students found that 3/3 got it wrong, so it's not limited to non-economists. It's actually a very difficult concept to know what opportunity costs are. But in general, it's the best alternative use of a resource, in this case a hectare of forest. So what is the foregone profit or agriculture rent? And if you want to do it correctly, you should also deduct what you can get from sustainable forest use. So it's a difference between, say, the agricultural rent and the forest rent. And perhaps you also want to include some timber values. And it's a confusion because something's annual and it's net present values per hectare, per carbon, per CO2, or per household. Now, I think in this simple scheme here, I can't go through it, but opportunity cost is one type of cost. Then you have the implementation transaction costs. It's another paper by Cecilia Luttrell, also from this project that I will not go through. And then you can talk about transfer. Transfers are not costs. It's cost for the agent that has to pay, but for those that receive, it's an income, so in net, it's 0. There are some forest users, they have opportunity cost of -50, but they're compensated, so they have a net gain. Some have a cost not compensated, and some have no cost but still compensated. It's kind of the non-targeting. And you can see villages have NGOs, the proponents, the local governments, national governments, they have implementation costs, and they may or may not be funded, in this case a foreign donor. So this is kind of a useful scheme to have, the two types of costs and the transfers and the net for the different actors that are involved. So what are the opportunity costs? Well, first I looked at this cost per ton of carbon, where you take agriculture income per hectare and divide it by how many tons you have. And the variation, if in the annual or in the net present value, say the net present value is from 6 to almost 1,000. It's so large that it's not very useful with such a large span. Okay, there's some, actually this surprising that the two highest sites are in Tanzania, but they get it because the denominator is so low, the tons of carbon per hectare is so low. But still, overall, in 6 out of the 17 sites, the opportunity cost is below the voluntary market price that, when the period they looked at was a little bit more than $3 per ton CO2, and well below this what's called the social cost of carbon, which is estimated around 35, 40, but some may say it's a lot higher, so it's a debate, but still with a relatively low. In almost all, except one Tanzanian site, it's defensible. So in that way, is REDD cheap? Yes, it is, in terms of opportunity cost at least. Just go quickly through this. They also looked at opportunity cost per household level, where you have to take this, how much do they plan to deforest, so you have to multiply this with areas planned. And a lower bound is just to look at kind of the historical reference level, how much did they deforest over the last few years. You have 10 seconds to digest the table. In general, much higher opportunity cost for the rich households, mainly because they plan to deforest more or have done so in the past. it has two important implications, that if you have a differentiated pay, you pay just opportunity cost, you'll pay a lot more to the rich ones. That is what you should do if you're very concerned about efficiency. Don't waste your money and give this kind of information or red rent to the households, because they can be spent on others to reduce deforestation. If you have a flat pay, you can argue with equity, higher rent to the poor, so the poor will benefit. They will have a surplus in the way that the transfer is higher than their opportunity cost. So it illustrates a equity efficiency trade-off that is often seen. Question 6, did REDD projects comply with the safeguards, by Amy Duchel and a few others? Look at change in 3 aspects: right participation and social co-benefits or social well-being. And what is the key of this paper? You differentiate based on the type of intervention. Is it just carrots? Is it also sticks? Or you have a combination of carrots and sticks? Here's a type of interventions. You can maybe not read it, it's a bit blurred, but still you see the yellow, which is the incentives where you have some non-conditional or conditional pay and livelihoods and enhancement to the households provided. The other are the more disincentives, the more restrictions, the command and control measures that you see dominant. And in some, say in Vietnam, in Indonesia, the yellow are really in and together with both are in dominating, but in Peru and Brazil, just the disincentives or command and control are strong. The interesting is to look at how how the change was affected by or differed by the type of the intervention. So here you see the before and after. The before, the blue, and the after is the red. And tenure security, the good news, it overall, in most of the interventions, it did not really change. In fact, it went a little bit down if you were more or less the same if you take the all. But it's one important difference that it was severely reduced tenure insecurity for this CAC, command and control measures or disincentives. But in the countries that had not, the Asian countries, Tanzania included, actually it was a positive effect. Knowledge and participation, you have these two here, and how it was. They ask, how was it in the project? Did you feel you have good? So it's no change variable here. And in general, quite okay. But again, what stands out is that much lower participation in this disincentives, the command restrictive type of intervention. For example, in the case of Brazil, only 14% participation, or was reported that they participate in the implementation of this, while 62% for the more positive incentives. Subjective well-being, not large changes reported. What's interesting, both this and another paper by William Sunderland and colleagues in Forests, also from this year, is that small changes, and this is just 3-4 years, but the change is generally positive in this subjective well-being, self-reported change. So REDD overall did not do harm. It seems to have done a little bit of the opposite, if anything. So it's also some good news to report. Forest clearing, final household reported, so it's not GIS-based. And just get this from Brazil, which is, of course, an important forest country, that the much higher effectiveness in reducing by this disincentives or regulation. So what we have seems to be a trade-off in terms of carbon effectiveness and tenure security and well-being, and this tension between carbon and non-carbon and safeguard values that comes out of this. So we have to walk the line. Finally, a very small paper, but more relating to an important debate. Has REDD worked? Did it meet our initial, quite optimistic expectations? And the answer is probably not. It may partly be because we were too optimistic, of course. But I just made one example here, which is the tree cover change with a 25% definition of tree cover or canopy cover as the definition of a forest for the 3 most important tropical forest countries, at least in terms of area. And you see there's not much change since REDD started 2007, 8, 9, 10, that period. In fact, for one, it's a clear upward trend, DRC. Why hasn't it? And we provided 4 explanations of this. The first is to say that REDD is too small. When we started, Stern report and others say you need 10, 15, maybe $20 billion per year to do REDD, to reduce it by half. It was used as an example. What we have gotten is about 10 billion so far, with less than 1 billion per year and declining. Erik Solheim, the current head of UNEP, then Minister of Environment of Norway, said in a preface to one of the early CIFOR books on this that we can only achieve it if REDD is included in a global climate regime. And we are still waiting for that regime, at least the regime that we thought of, namely a cap and trade system with commitments from the countries that we thought of in 2008 and in Copenhagen in 2009. So, simply not enough funding. Second possible answer, strong business as usual continue to dominate and therefore not much has happened. And we've already seen and argued that this is indeed the case. Powerful business as usual coalitions dominate. They are strong. Indonesia, Brazil, 2 examples. In spite of some local successes that you can see, they are dominant. 3, well, REDD was not implemented the way we thought. It was thought to be national policies and payment for environmental services, but what we have gotten is this large ineffective ICDPs. Let me say, I'm not saying, I'm putting this forward as kind of hypothesis, and I'm not saying that it's correct, but it's arguments that you hear. So the ICDPs, the REDD project can be seen as kind of an extension of these with some result-based payment. Textbook PES with hard conditionality are not common. And you hear the term unconditional PES, which is a contradiction in terms. So that's at the project level. At the others, there's been a strong project, I found a new word, projectification of REDD, that the national policies that we thought of are not being implemented, at least not at the scale as we envisioned 10 years ago. So NGOs were ready to relabel projects and to tap into new funding has been argued as one argument. The other was that kind of, and this M1 component of this project have been looking at this, that REDD in some countries are kind of marginalized to harmless to the business as usual interest, into harmless projects and not the broad policies. And I often used to say that policies win battles and projects win battles, but policies win the war. And I think that what we wanted to address with REDD 10 years ago, and we haven't come that far. Final explanation is that what provoked this response to an article by Fletcher and 3 others in Conservation Biology, that PES, well, first REDD is PES, and PES is being flawed and a contradiction. And we took some issues with that. First, that while PES is challenging, it's costly, you have to select, measure, you have to define the reference level in terms of the counterfactual, etc., etc. It's not an easy thing. But it's also based on some misunderstandings, the critique, and maybe some ideological resistance also. Some we think that is not so strong, for example, the crowding out of intrinsic conservation motivation that is not as strong as often or sometimes argued. In general, there are few large PES examples, so I don't think it can explain the alleged REDD failure. So, as I'm a teacher and often have to grade, here are my grades for the 4 explanations. I give 1 A. For the business as usual interests, they dominate. True. The question is, of course, how to change it. Not enough money. True. But would big money have solved it? We don't know. And also that it was not PES and national policies, which I think is a good explanation. Of course, again, we cannot be sure that if they have implemented textbook PES, it would have worked. And PES is flawed, as I just said. It hard to say that something that was not really implemented is the reason for the failure. But maybe the rhetoric has led to a wrong focus. That's why I didn't give it an F but a D. Let me sum up. We have stressed a lot that REDD is a learning experience. And the question should not be, should we continue with REDD or not, as some are increasingly whispering in the corridors, but rather, what have we learned that can make our current and future efforts to reduce forest emissions more effective, efficient, and equitable? I think just to dismiss REDD and telling unfounded success stories, both traps on both sides, we need to walk the line again, that prevent learning. And this writing of the lessons learned has just begun, and also some lessons learned are still lessons to be learned by the broader REDD community. So thanks for those who have contributed. Here are the articles when we make this presentation available, and to the financial support. Thank you.
Thank you. May I ask the other panelists to come in front? So we have Larson of CIFOR, Martius from Ethiopia, Juan Chang from GCF, and we have from AIPP, Kisale. Thank you. So that was, I thought it was quite interesting. So we'll start with a panel discussion. I'll just call the colleagues in the order I called them, and then we'll open the panel also for comments from the audience. Should we start with Anne?
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. So I was reading an article last week that was about 3 different views of power in environmental governance, and I realized it's a really nice way to frame the remarks I was going to make today about multi-level governance. The article is by Lena Parch from 2017. So first of all, I'm presenting on a study of multi-level governance that was done under the REDD work that Arild just presented. Most of this work was based on 750 interviews in 11 subnational regions in 5 different countries, around 54 different sites of land use change. And they were either land use changes such as deforestation and degradation, but also attempts to make positive changes such as pest programs, REDD, and conservation initiatives. We wanted to understand how ideas, projects, or programs like REDD entered this landscape of decision making and with what effect. We also conducted legal studies in each country, some different multi-level politics of MRV systems and so on as complements to this work. So first of all, it was a multi-level governance study. What do we mean by that? Multi-level governance is a term that's often interpreted normatively as a good in and of itself, and it's often understood as multi-level coordination. We did not take this assumption. We interpreted multi-level governance neither as a good or a bad, nor specifically as coordination, but as the nature of institutions driving land use and land use change. And we wanted to understand how decisions get made across levels and sectors as something to be researched and understood in more detail. So to come back to the question of power. So for me, what was helpful here was to distinguish a bit between power, which we usually think of as power over or coercive power, and power as enabling. So 3 different types of power. First is power to. And we found, so power to refers to entrepreneurs or people who are able to get things done. These individuals look for alternatives and make them happen. And in our research, we found that individuals can definitely make a difference. For example, in Indonesia, there was an oil palm company that maintained a conservation area as part of their concession, even against the will of the central government of Indonesia. They also went way beyond the legal requirements to get villagers on board in terms of participation and consent. In some cases where central government programs are contradictory, which they often are because there will often be conservation and programs of some kind at the same time there are policies that promote deforestation, individuals at the subnational level sometimes chose the ones that were more sustainable over the other options. They were able to influence local initiatives in this way, local landscape management. However, individuals aren't institutions, and in some cases, the individuals tend to be stronger than institutions. I think it's a common problem in developing countries. And when they leave, there's nothing there to keep their sustainable goals or policy decisions in place. So the second type of power is power with. That refers to leadership, shared values and shared learning, seeking compromise, looking for win-win solutions. So we also found a lot of efforts at shared learning around REDD. Peru's REDD roundtables, for example, which are both national and subnational. Mexico's technical consultative committees, the CTC, as well as I think some things we'll hear about from Mexico from Odette in a few minutes. The Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force is an excellent example of really moving with this vision. Again, Odette will talk about that. Most importantly, in every country, we heard this idea as that this was the main solution that everyone proposed: more multi-level, better multi-sectoral coordination. And it's what everyone wants, but we need to understand what makes this possible, what makes it work, because right now people are not coordinating for a reason. There are reasons behind this. And that brings us to the third type of power, which is the one we perhaps talk about more often, which is power over. Power over is about dominant actors, structures, and discourses getting their way. Power over is about winners and losers. So we definitely found examples of where powerful actors get their way. As you heard from Arild's presentation about business as usual was definitely the major finding, not only at the national level, but also at subnational level. So there were cases of private companies taking advantage of multi-level structures, such as well as ambivalent laws or lack of enforcement, including sometimes corruption, to forum shop or to play the politics of scale, to go to the level and scale of decision-making where they could get what they want. So you go to the central government if they're the ones can help you, but if they don't like what you want to do, you go to the subnational government. So subnational government doesn't like it, maybe you go to the municipal government. So there's all sorts of playing with the scale in order to get things, to get their way. In fact, we found that this kind of power over, is deeply embedded in the multi-level structures. That is, any single initiative like REDD is colored by the history and practice of relations between levels of government, as well as between government and local citizens. So in this light, it's problematic that REDD is generally being implemented with a very technocratic and top-down vision. From the same article by Sanders et al. That Arild mentioned, we wrote, an underlying assumption with the results challenge is that it's possible to get the formula right, the right ingredients, the right combination of actors and elements. So this is all part of trying to be apolitical, to avoid politics, and of course, who wouldn't want that? But unfortunately, it's not the world we live in. Politics is part of everything. So recognizing these embedded issues and building alternative platforms, such as the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, and addressing the demands for representation and rights are fundamental for bridging these gaps and winning and building bottom-up support for change. And we'll actually have a press conference tomorrow to release another recent study that we did on these issues around rights. So I hope you'll come to that tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the Bula Zone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Yetebitu.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am Yetebitu Mogas from Ethiopia. I am the National REDD Plus Coordinator. I would like to start with a comment. REDD is small by Professor, the earlier speaker. Yes, it is small now, but REDD is also big because it has a big vision. I think it has opened our eyes in developing countries on how to really look at the forest resource and its meaning in terms of sustainable development. And my country is very much convinced in that line. And now we have given forest sector the highest recognition in our green development strategy, which is actually promoted all across the world. So it is small when we see our history over the last 10 years, but we are just beginning. And it depends on how we look at it. For sure, the vision is, to many countries, it's very, very clear and it is big. And I don't think that any one country will stop just investing in forest development just because there is no transaction of money from the developed world. So the knowledge, the understanding, the awareness that is created so far has been really huge, and it has attracted, at least in my country, in some other countries, the attention of policy makers, governments. So I mean, it has done, although the investment is very small, and in fact, we are also, I mean, engaged in the readiness yet, and that investment, despite small, has really done a lot of things. This is our understanding. Even in terms of thinking in terms of planning the REDD+, we have learned a lot. It was so complex. Talking about MRV, reference level, has been so, I mean, a lot of discussions have been going on over so many countries, maybe over 100 countries, at least 47 in the World Bank system, the FCPF program. And what has been achieved so far in countries is really significant, also in terms of organizing your data, understanding the situation. I mean, that is something, that's a result for me. In fact, if you only look at the outcome, which is emission reduction, we need to take some time. We don't hurry to achieve that thing. It comes gradually. So I am very optimistic that countries are ready to invest. And I am also hopeful that the global process will be very quick in responding to those motivations now. I am sure the momentum is high, and this momentum should be supported by all parties, I believe. Okay, my country is looking at REDD, even in terms of its meaning. It is afforestation. It's reforestation because we have lost most of our forest resources during the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. And we have also remaining forests that must be preserved. And we have a concrete strategy now in saving the existing forests, at the same time in, of course, restoring the forest resources. And that is, I mean, our understanding. And at least some countries understand our vision, and they are supporting us, in fact, in realizing that vision. Example, Norway is working with us. In fact, REDD+ is a big program in my country, and the climate resilient green strategy that has been promoted by our late Prime Minister hopes to achieve the emissions targets from forest sector, and that would largely come through this national and subnational REDD programs. 50% of the emission is managed through this program. So it's big. We continue to in fact, we anticipate support, not only finance, in fact, also technical support to realize this big vision we have, and we have committed to the international community. During our readiness, of course, we had, UN REDD and FCPF have different standards. In the FCPF, we have 9 standards that must be fulfilled. Indeed, Ethiopia has done that, and we've got the endorsement last September in Laos. You see, let's take, for example, the safeguards. The Cancun safeguards in the FCPF, they are not 100% the same. And even the essential principles might be the same, but in terms of delivering on, putting in place the systems, we have difficulties, So it might be important to actually come to the same, principles and modalities. So some countries are still struggling. And setting the reference level, we can only do it only for deforestation. It is easy for deforestation, but for the other 4 activities, still many countries are struggling, and I don't see really the level of support that is required from partners, and I think we need to help countries in that regard. Degradation in some countries, for example, in my country, is expected to emit like 40% from the forest sector. But we don't have means to monitor whether we have achieved results or not. It's just open question. Reforestation is also, it needs really a bit, a bit precise methods to monitor and report, and these are still open. Of course, we tried to establish baseline for reforestation, but that was just an initial idea. The other point that I would like to actually talk about is, subnational. We have a subnational, by the way, program, REDD program in Ethiopia, in Oromia regional state. We call it Oromia Forest and Landscape Program. And this program is big. And there was really a series of, of course, critics from different directions. Oromia is like one third or 1/4 of our country, and all the program boundary is the state itself. We have a forest which covers like 20% of that state, and all the accounting is done within that state, and one part of the state could be active culturally or institutionally in terms of forest management, the other is not. And when it comes to payment for performance, of course, everything should be summed up, and the overall result would be positive or negative, and that has somehow implication to actors there, including the government, whether or not we could really get REDD credits. These are issues, and the current move is like implementing REDD Plus at scale, and this is a challenge that I think scientists have to really look into. In terms of, this is where we stand, actually. We have been doing the readiness and the investment in parallel, and we have gone thus far, and I am very, very happy personally to see that REDD support has been very instrumental in creating awareness to our government officials, parliamentarians, so that they really have now positive support towards this REDD Plus program. But even the future is not certain. This is the thing that many countries are contemplating right now. In fact, some countries are doing it bilateral or with a small group of governments. They have programs that are still running, but the ambition is too big compared to really the kind of support that is expected by countries. My country is just like that. So how are we going to maintain this important program that could transform really communities, even countries like Ethiopia? We expect a lot from the forest, because if we develop the forest, we know that we will have water, and if we have water, we have electricity, hydro, very huge potential, and if we have that, we have industrialization, urban development, we have irrigation, food security. It has a lot of implication, we have a big, ambitious strategy, even within this CRG and REDD Plus framework, but that needs a lot of investment. And developing countries, especially the least developing countries, have, competing interests or budgetary interests. Mainly, government focuses on saving lives of people, food, health, and of course, education. So how are they going to really invest all those millions, or maybe hundreds of millions of dollars every year to bring, that huge transformative change? That's the question. So, the world should be ready to maintain this momentum, or even actually push it forward, so that we will achieve eventually what we have dreamt for 10 years ago. I would like to finalize by saying that we work for carbon. While doing for carbon, of course, we know that we are doing so many things in terms of provision of ecological services. Recently, I read an article how the Congo forest is related to the rainfall in Ethiopian highlands. I haven't thought about this before, and I was really, I was like, okay, is there such interconnections, teleconnections? have we seen those also in terms of really, its implication, not only in terms of really managing the climate system, but also managing, droughts, people's lives. So, I mean, the CIFOR, they are here, our scientists are here, they are really doing a good job in terms of social science. And I mean, institutions like World Meteorological Organization could also see how really this teleconnections between regions in terms of moisture, which is very critical in Africa, of course, in the tropics, how it affects us, how are they connected and how they affect our livelihoods. So by saying this, it's my hope that countries are waiting for the world. They are, most of the countries are at the middle, or maybe at least in the World Bank system, I know that 10 countries are already ready. So they are anticipating, financial support for investment. But REDD Plus, in terms of its modality, says that I give you after you deliver. And this one might have really serious consequences for programs, especially in least developed countries. If they don't get money for the investment, if we are waiting for the payment after performance, after emission reduction, that might challenge our program. So, yeah, this is actually what I would like to say from our experience in Ethiopia and our understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Yetebitu. Let's hear now from Juan from the Green Climate Fund.
Okay, well, first of all, apologies. Thank you for the invitation and apologies for being late here. I was in another meeting in the Bula zone. It took me a while. Okay, actually, you got me by surprise asking me. It's, well, I can share the news how GCF has gone through implementing REDD Plus from most recently, in the recent board decision, there was an approval of $500 million for REDD Plus results-based payments, which closes the options for financing REDD Plus in the GCF. One board meeting before at B17, the board also approved guidance and encourages countries to request financing from the GCF for early phases of REDD Plus. So at the moment, GCF is in a position to provide funds for implementing REDD Plus in all 3 phases, which is great news. I think that at the moment is one of the institutions that is giving the whole range of menu for financing REDD Plus. Now, what we have been also facing at the moment is a challenge of how countries are translating their strategies into financial investments. I think that over the last several years, since all the previous initiatives like the FCPF, UN REDD, there has been significant process in designing the structures and the governance around REDD Plus implementation. And now we're in a phase that we are actually, with all the instruments in place, to implement REDD Plus as a whole, as it was conceived 10 years ago. But still there's a challenge. How do we translate all these policies that are captured in the strategies into actual investments? GCF has approved so far in forestry and land use around $270 million in 1 year and a half that the fund is approving projects. And we see in the recent submissions that we're receiving a large interest of proposals. And what we see is also very attractive is how countries are taking their strategies and trying to design investments around that. But as I said, still there's a challenge. How you take a document that was designed at the policy level and you convert that into a financial instrument, a document, a financial plan. Here, what we also face in the GCF is how can we ensure that with the limited public funds that we have as a climate fund, how can we provide the required funding for countries to implement their strategies? In many cases, the implementation of strategies is of several billions in some countries, according to some studies I saw. So it will not be possible for public funds from climate finance to cover that gap. So what we are encouraging now is to diversify or innovate in the financial instruments and catalyze private sector. And you were mentioning actually the challenge of coming from subnational to national. At the end of the day, the implementation of actions happens at the level of even at the farm, at the scale of individual. How do we translate all these policies at the national level into actually on the ground implementation is a huge challenge. And how in that process we also attract the sufficient investments that are required in order to achieve transformational change. In the GCF, that is called paradigm shift, and we see this as a long-term process. I think that there is that's another issue. What we have been observing in the GCF is there is high expectation that in short time frames we will achieve those results. I think that it's going to take a bit more time than what actually we're expecting. And we expect that when this translation of the strategies into financial plans is designed, there is also a long-term planning process of how finance should come at different points of time in order to trigger those results. I think that's more or less what we have been doing in GCF.
Thank you. Juan, let me call now Katie from the Indigenous Peoples, Asian Indigenous Peoples Platform, to give us the Indigenous Peoples perspective.
Thank you very much. Just let me introduce myself a bit. My name is Ketisak. I'm coming from Thailand. I'm working with the Asia Indigenous People Pact, a regional organizations of indigenous people. We have member organizations in 14 countries, 48 member organizations. We have both the national network organizations and also the local and subnational organizations. AIPP actually also been engaging with the REDD Plus for a couple of years already, because we also believe that because when we heard about REDD Plus, we also thought that REDD Plus might also cause negative impact to indigenous people. That's why we also try to engage and try to build capacity for our member organizations so that they can engage effectively in the REDD Plus related activities, and just to ensure that their rights be respected and promoted in the REDD Plus implementation. So that's the background of the IPP. And then for the Indigenous People Platform, the full name is the Local Communities and Indigenous People Knowledge Sharing Platform, the one that was agreed by the COP decisions, COP21 in 2015 in Paris. So COP21 actually recognized the need to strengthen knowledge, technologies, practices, and effort of local communities and indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change, and also to establish a platform for exchange of experiences and sharing of best practices on mitigation, adaptation in a holistic and integrated manner. So this actually are decisions that used as a basis for the COP to discuss and try to discuss how to establish this platform. The idea is to have this kind of platform to invite knowledge holders and also other relevant stakeholders to interact with each other and also with the parties. So we are still discussing the functions of this body and structures, how this platform are going to be placed. And we also hope that at this COP, the parties will come up with concrete decisions that will guide us and how we're going to operationalize these decisions so that we can fully engage and interact in the UNCCC. Just to give you a little bit more information. So there's still, since 2015, there are a couple of activities that we engage with the parties and also the indigenous people themselves, just to try to get ready and try to prepare our positions and inputs into this kind of process. There are a couple of activities that has done in relation to these issues. For instance, in March 2015, the Secretariat called for submissions, and there's also many organizations, both indigenous people organizations, civil societies, and also the intergovernmental organizations, and also the parties. They also submit their views on how this platform going to be function, like contents, purposes, and also structure on these issues. In addition to this, there are also a couple of informal consultations. Just try to discuss in deeper detail about this body. For instance, the informal consultations in Brazil, that also sponsored by the EU, and another informal consultation was also supported by the government of Canada. And and now, at the COP23, this issue was also placed under one of the agenda items under the substar, item 13. So now they are already established a contact group. Now they're still in the process of informal discussions and try to come up with a concrete idea how this platform is going to be established and how it's going to be operationalized at different level. But for us, we really want to see this kind of thing to be one of the main outcomes to come up with this COP. So it's still ongoing issues, and we also believe that one is established, so we have a platform where we can share our knowledge and also best practice that also can be used for enhancing the implementation of the climate-related actions at both policy and also the implementation level. So that's probably a really short update on the indigenous people platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Then with that, last, and should be there'll be a translator with the two translator then intervention, which will be in Spanish.
Your micro.
There'll be that will not speak, and there'll be a translator from for her because she'll speak in Spanish.
Thank you very much. Bueno, vengo de Jalisco, México, y voy a hablar sobre la experiencia de este gobierno subnacional que se ha abierto puertas a nivel internacional a través del grupo de trabajo de gobernadores sobre el clima y los bosques.
My name is Odette, and I represent the Jalisco government, which has been established with it's part of the Governors and Climate and Forest Task Force, and
yes, don't worry. That is like a window, international window for the subnational government. Yes. So, con esta oportunidad de firma de declaratoria de Río Blanco para siendo parte del GCF, se juntó una oportunidad y la voluntad también del gobernador para ser líder en este avance de Red Más en nuestro país.
So, with the signing of the Rio Branco declaration by the members of the GCF, the governor of Jalisco became a leader in kind of like this initiative in what the declaration proposed.
Y bueno, Jalisco es uno de los 5 estados que pertenece a este GCF y vienen consolidando desde 2011 en acompañamiento con la federación, consolidando mecanismos de gobernanza ambiental y de fortalecimientos de capacidad a nivel local.
So Jalisco is one of 5 Mexican states in the GCF, which have been consolidating mechanisms of environmental governance and generation of local capacities in REDD+ areas.
Y una muy fuerte relación a nivel federal.
And they have a very strong relationship at the federal level.
Y esto nos ha permitido probar la visión de México sobre REDD+, que es el manejo integrado del territorio con un enfoque de desarrollo rural sustentable bajo en emisiones.
So this has allowed for the implementation of the Mexican kind of like taken REDD+, which follows this integrated management of landscape with a focus on low emission rural development.
Y bueno, la federación a su vez se retroalimenta con nuestra experiencia a nivel local. Hay mucho diálogo de abajo hacia arriba y siempre hemos acompañado el mecanismo pues a nivel federal de la construcción de REDD+ en México.
So the experiences in Jalisco and in the other GCF member states in Mexico, there's kind of like bottom-up discussions of REDD+ has consistently been feeding up to the GCFs,
And to the federation.
to the GCFs and to the kind of like the further government policies on the topic.
Entonces, con esta oportunidad que se abre del Green Climate Fund, pues hemos podido identificar algunos retos, avances e innovaciones que tenemos en Jalisco.
So with possibilities like the one of the Green Climate Fund that Juan was talking about, the government in Jalisco has been able to start finding kind of like the challenges and the benefits that they're facing in terms of REDD+.
Y uno de estos es ver cómo vamos a implementar los esfuerzos para que las actividades de manejo y de uso sustentable de los recursos sean más rentables que otras actividades en el campo.
So part of this is trying to find how
De manejo sustentable.
how activities related to sustainable management of resources may be more profitable for people than other productive activities that in the same territory.
Y un mecanismo para hacer esto fue que se hizo un convenio para la implementación de la iniciativa de reducción de emisiones entre el gobierno federal y el gobierno estatal.
So part of this was the
Isn't great.
part of this.
Sí, que se hizo un convenio entre la federación y el gobierno subnacional.
So there was this an agreement between the subnational government and the federal government
Para implementar la iniciativa de reducción de emisiones.
to implement initiatives on dealing with the reduction of emissions,
Que es el pilotaje de red.
which is like the pilot of REDD+ in Mexico.
Y este acuerdo no solamente lo firmó la Secretaría Ambiental de donde yo vengo, sino que también lo hizo la Secretaría de Desarrollo Rural, que es el sector agropecuario.
So it wasn't just the office that she works with, the environmental office that signed this agreement, but it was also the kind of like the agricultural office that took part in this.
Ajá. Y eso nos ayudó a alinear las políticas de dos sectores que que suelen ser antagónicos en el territorio.
Which allowed them to align the policies of two different sectors that are normally seen as competing over the same kind of like territory.
Y otro de los retos es que vamos a generar estos mecanismos de distribución de beneficios, cómo se van a generar y cómo van a bajar el pago por resultados a la población vulnerable y a las mujeres.
So another of the challenges is about the distribution of benefits, especially in how they will reach vulnerable populations and also specifically women.
Porque las mujeres no tienen la propiedad legal de la tierra, ¿no?
Because women do not have the legal ownership of land.
Y bueno, también hay necesidad de crear capacidades locales para implementar proyectos como sistemas agroforestales que se habían perdido y que ahora necesitan recuperarse y ser también resilientes para la situación actual del cambio climático.
So there's also need to build capacities at the local level for
Sistemas agroforestales.
for agroforestry systems and practices that you were saying they have been lost in the past, like in the recent past.
Porque nos hemos dado cuenta que aunque el sector agropecuario ya apoye estas actividades que hacen el manejo más sustentable del territorio, actividades productivas más sustentables, pues las capacidades locales no existen.
So even though there's support for these kind of activities, there's no local capacity to actually put them in practice.
También otro reto es mantener plataformas de participación social para el diálogo continuo desde el nivel más bajo hasta el nivel hasta la federación, ¿no? Es otro reto, mantener plataformas, aunque ya existen los comités técnicos consultivos REDD+.
So another big challenge is being able to maintaining these platforms for participation to create some kind of like continuous dialogue with institutions and civil society for the design and implementation and the evaluation of public policy.
Yeah. Bueno. Y bueno, Jalisco tiene un fondo, hubo la necesidad de crear un fondo para que el pago por resultados de REDD+ fluyera de manera directa hasta la población local que está en el territorio haciendo manejo sustentable de los recursos.
So Jalisco has its own fund so that the people that are actually carrying out a sustainable use and management of resources are actually being paid for what they're doing.
Y esa es una de las innovaciones que tiene Jalisco, aparte de tener unas juntas intermunicipales de medio ambiente que manejan el territorio a nivel de cuenca hidrográfica.
So that's one of the innovations that Jalisco has, as well as the ¿cómo se dice en español?
Juntas intermunicipales de medio ambiente.
Intermunicipal environmental bodies that are delimited by by a hydrologic basin.
Y esas nos ayudan a hacer actividades productivas en el territorio que estén con esa visión de México REDD, ¿no? El manejo integrado del territorio.
Which allows for the implementation of productive activities that follow the vision of Mexico REDD.
Estas juntas tienen también consejos de participación social y que ayudan a subir las necesidades del territorio hacia niveles más altos de la política, ¿no?
So these juntas also have like larger spaces for participation that allow for a more bottom-up kind of like approach to informing policy.
Y bueno, por último quisiera mencionar que México es el primer país, tengo entendido, que tiene un sistema de información de salvaguardas, que era uno de los requisitos para implementar REDD+.
So Mexico is one of the first countries that has a system of
Safeguards.
For information of safeguards, which is, as you know, one of the necessary requirements for the implementation of payments for.
Y Jalisco ya tiene su plan estatal de salvaguardas y está reportando a la Federación el respeto de estas salvaguardas.
And Jalisco has its own plan for safeguards and is already reporting it to the national government.
And thank you.
Thank you, Ed. We have 10 minutes. I think we're quite strict about the time here, so we have 10 minutes. Let's get at least 3 comments or questions, and then we'll ask the panel to respond, if any. Yes, please. 1, and then 2, and the one in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Mafabi from Uganda, and we are implementing REDD+ in advanced stages. Now, the question really is, it casts a lot of doubt as to whether REDD Plus works. And if it does, at what point do we begin to see the required changes? And two, are there low-hanging fruits that one can begin to harvest before REDD Plus actually comes into effect?
Hello, Noémie de Lagos from S&P Global Ratings. I have just a question for the panelists about private investment. Do you think it's possible to attract more private investments, and how do you secure, I guess, the revenue streams to pay back private investors if you bring them into the financing of REDD schemes? Thank you.
Is there anyone else that want to ask a question at this point? No, so we can answer quickly the low-hanging fruit question. And Arild, you might not want to say something also, but Anne, you wanna? Or the private sector question, who would want to answer? Okay.
Okay, I have also the opportunity to clarify that there are two GCF, by the way. So I work at the Green Climate Fund, it's also GCF, and there's the Governor's Task Force for Forests, it's also called GCF, just to make a clarity. On the private sector, as we see in the GCF, in this GCF, there are potentially two avenues for private sector engagement and how they can be involved. Or two, let's say, in brackets, groups of private sectors working on or investing in actions that will lead to emission reductions. There can be those that are investing in commodities and deforestation-free commodities or zero emission commodities, where I think that from the GCF, what we can provide is the risk, the perception of investments, so they can catalyze or participate on those areas where it's not as attractive as commercially perceived without any other incentive. So GCF can provide that for private sector engagement. Then you have the other private sector that are actually REDD Plus private sector. They have been investing in REDD Plus projects and the expectation of having revenues from emission reductions. In this sense, we are actually exploring, this is very interesting. As I mentioned before, GCF recently approved a results-based payment mechanism which works under the frame of the UNCCC, but works at the level that probably is too big for an investment like a REDD Plus project, which is within a subnational level. So what we are discussing with some potential investors is how they can, with their investments at the local level or project level, scale up to the size that allows the country receiving results-based payments aligned to what has been decided at the UNCCC, national, subnational. So what GCF can do is help the countries hosting those private investments to move to the scale that allows them to access to UNCCC, but also GCF can be at the end of the value chain, giving certain comfort to the private sector that if they don't find a market where they can sell those emission reductions, GCF would be in a position to pay for them. Okay, so there are these possibilities, but we're always open to explore many others if any ideas are.
Thank you. Anyone would like to answer, especially the low-hanging fruit question? I mean, are there low-hanging fruits here? Arild, would you want to answer that?
Thanks for two good questions. When can we expect to see results? 3 years ago, I said in 2-3 years' time. So it's kind of, I guess I still say the same, not 2017, but 2-3 years' time. I think, and as was stressed here by Juan, it's also that it is a long-term project. And when you changing institutions, policy process, it takes an awful lot of time, a lot more than we have. I think it's reasonably from what I said, the GCS project, there are some small positive signs at the local level. At the national, at these overall deforestation rates and etc., you don't see that. So I don't have a good answer. The low-hanging fruits, I think what has been pointed out as a kind of a simple low for a few countries that they have costly policies that they're costly in terms of government budgets that are stimulating deforestation. In Brazil, that has been related to kind of subsidized credits for agricultural expansion, colonialization. That has been important. So you have some kind of removing these subsidies that are encouraging. It was another study done by ODI on 4 deforestation commodities, about $40 billion per year, kind of removing these fossil fuel subsidies if you go outside the land use sector. So I think that's an area to look into. Things that are costly to governments but seems to stimulate forest clearing and sustainable use.
Thank you. Yes, Juan.
Just maybe I can add, because what is very interesting, what happened with REDD+, thank you, Paul, very interesting question, is that as we know, we are all, I think this is like a church, we are all believers, so we don't need to convince ourselves that we're talking about, but we also know that in the process in countries, forestry was the most depressed sector in most of the countries, because you cannot compete with agriculture, infrastructure, and others. So having a forest in the agenda of national development, having countries developing their forest monitoring systems, I think that's already low-hanging fruits, and that's already results, intermediate results. If we want to measure REDD+ in tons of CO2, that might take time, and eventually they're already at the local level, it's already happening. But the transformational change, as Arild said, might take a long time. But we can also measure intermediate products. Having a monitoring system already has changed a lot in many countries. They didn't have a monitoring system, and that's a very basic tool to do proper forest management, forest land use, or land use planning, and so on. So I would count intermediate results, and I think it's very encouraging to see that on the ground already.
Thank you. I think we're done. we ran out of time. This is very, very interesting, I thought. And what's clear to me is as we move forward in this, it's like, you know, unwrapping things, and underneath there's still lots of issues that we have to work on. But the only way we can go is actually to work on it on the ground. Thank you.